Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm very pleased to welcome Brian Solis to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. He's here to discuss his book, X, in which he explores the importance of experiences and how to design for them. He's a principal analyst at Altimeter and focuses on digital transformation, customer experience, culture 2.0, and the future of industries, trends, and behavior. He is the author of 7 books, including The End of Business as Usual and Engage. Lastly, he blogs about insights into the future of business, new technologies, and marketing at briansolis.com. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Amy, that's such a soothing voice. I just got so relaxed. Well, thank you very much for being here. I very much appreciate it. And to all those who are online, thank you very much. I am an author, yes, 7 books. This is number 7, lucky number 7, I guess. But I also feel like it's my first book because when you're talking about the idea of experiences, there's a great irony in talking about experience design in a book format. Because it's 2016, and we live in an always-on world where you could swipe right, pinch and zoom, do all of these things, yet we haven't really reimagined what a print book could be now, right? And it's the same thing that you look around everywhere. What could we do differently today if we just took a step back to realize that maybe we're just taking these processes or things for granted and reinvented them for today? So I started with the idea of what could a book be now, and I used teenagers as sort of my inspiration. When I started the book, it took 3.5 years to make this book, partly because the subject was a little bit crazy, and the other part was just having to, think about a book. Teenagers 3.5 years ago, when doing their homework, could focus for 6 minutes before reaching for some kind of device. And I thought at that time, oh man, what am I going to do in 6 minutes? How do you engage someone in 6-minute bursts? And by the time I was done writing the book, it had dropped to 60 seconds. And if you think about what happened in the last 3.5 years, right? Smartphones became more pervasive. We got more devices. We got more tablets. We got more YouTubes. We got more Snapchats. And technology essentially permeated every aspect of ours, theirs, lives. And now the ability to focus for 6 minutes would be a luxury, right? And that is where this story begins, because now everything changes, because you have to capture attention, you have to be relevant, you have to be engaging in these little micro bursts of attention, and they have to matter. And in that regard, everything could and should be different today. And that was the part of the inspiration for this book. The other part was, we all talk about experiences. We all love great experiences. We all hate bad experiences. But when I asked people, what makes an experience matter to you? I got 1,000 different answers. And then I started to look up, well, what's the definition of experience? I just couldn't find anything like that I could hold on to and then write a book around. So starting from scratch with what a book could be, what could an experience be or should be, and then how do we design them? So for those who get the book, you will notice firstly that it's a different shape. And I used the iPad Air, or a Surface, depending on which one you want to look at, as the inspiration for familiarity, because that's a blank canvas, right? And it's a familiar canvas, whereas the textbook is sort of our floppy disk, right? It just doesn't necessarily have to have relevance today. And then you'll notice that there is no table of contents. Turns out that when you study today's brain and how it engages online and also how it engages in the small screen, we tend to look for things very quickly and grab onto them and move from there. So I reverse engineered a lot of this. I studied UX, I studied UI, I studied how people engage some of their favorite apps, and tried to bring those insights onto paper. Rather than trying to create the coolest digital experience, why not show you what it could do in an analog world? Because if you can take all of those insights and apply it to a paper-bound book, imagine what you can do with everything, right? Because it affects preferences, it affects decision-making, it affects values. I also had to relearn how to write sentences, which is crazy, right? Because as an author, the first thing I tended to do was start writing. I have all of this expertise, I want to share it with you. But then no one would read it, right? Because the brain would shut off, or retention would go down, or the willingness to want to turn the pages would just sort of dwindle. And then how many sentences could you put together before you need white space, or before you need a visual, or before you maybe are inspired to translate a paragraph into visual learning? To say that my mind was blown is an understatement. I was completely debilitated. I didn't want to finish the book. I wanted to give up. I missed about 5 deadlines to get this thing out. And that was all because it was a very human experience to go through in order to share with you also then how do you build an experience. And it starts quite literally with an out-of-body experience. One of the quotes, or one of the things that inspired this book was a commencement speech by David Foster Wallace, where he talked about this is water. How many of you have seen that? Oh, just a few. Okay, well, then I'll explain it. So he is speaking to a group of university students, and he says that, he tells this story of some fish swimming in a fishbowl. And these 2 fish are just sort of starting their morning, and another fish passes by and says, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 fish look at each other and say, "Water? What's he talking about?" And the story to me is a metaphor for how we sort of live life, right? We go through everything with the processes and the systems that we have, and we try to be innovative within those environments, right? And that's that perpetual box we're supposed to think outside of. But in the concept of this is water, I think about water as sort of a canvas, right? These are the things we go through daily, yet we take them for granted when we could actually look at them as opportunities for inspiration. Because you get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't, right? And the more connected you become, I found that the more empowered you become. And the more empowered you become, the more demanding you become. This is why we see so much disruption today, right? Because people have choices and they're starting to exercise them differently because things are starting to feel foreign. Things are starting to feel old. And when they do, that's someone's idea to come in and just change the game, right? And one of the most often used examples is Uber, right? Nobody who uses an Uber goes back to taxis. But at the same time, it is the quintessential customer experience because it brings something to you and you can track it. I've also studied how long patience lasts for Uber. I think the number now is 4 minutes or less. Anything above that, you're canceling, right? Yet, you've got a car coming to you, and you can track it. Wow. It's like the Louis C.K., I don't know if you've heard his rant about Wi-Fi on an airplane. It's the same sort of thing. And so I looked at experience then from all aspects, right? From music to movies to brand. And brand seemed to be the one that stuck the most because business was really in dire need of reinvention. And the same things I've learned about business and brand, I've learned about education, I've learned about government. All of these things about how technology is changing us, we have to reinvent all of these things. But the idea of it is that there's what we say we do, right? And then there's the reality. What do people experience? And more so, what do they share? Because the shared experience is actually what matters, right? And in today's online society, none of these experiences disappear. They just compile and collect and they become indexable. And so I think part of our work is to study, well, what's the experience divide, right? Our promise versus what people do, right? No one tweets United Airlines because they're happy, right? Yet if you look at United's site, they talk about how amazing they are. And I'm sure they're trying, but the reality is that you have to design for human beings, and you have to design for the moments of which they experience your products and services, because how they react is the reality, right? And that is then, what is experience? Because I don't think we have really sat down and swallowed this one yet. because once we do, I think there's an empathetic pill that we can start to create. I closed my eyes, and these are the first words of the book. Close your eyes and try to remember that last moment that really touched you, that really moved you, that really inspired you. What was it about it, right? What made you feel special? What inspired you to do something differently? Because it's moments like that where an experience begins, because it's something you feel, right? It's something you sense. And it's supposed to affect what you do. And that's the power of an experience. And they require design. And today we leave those moments, those deep moments, up to chance, right? We could get away with it for a long time, but now we're starting to see that we can't, right? Everything's ripe for disruption. And I think if we're waiting for somebody to tell us what to do, we're on the wrong side of innovation. This is that moment where, not just in this book, but in all of my research and study and innovation, it starts with perspective, right? It starts with seeing things differently in order to do things differently. All businesses have to have some type of emotional attachment to their customers now. I just wrote a paper, everything every business could learn from the state of the music industry. Except the music industry, of course. When I was a kid, I used to put posters of my favorite artists on the wall, right? Because they were going to be around a while. I wanted to be like them. And if you think about artistry today, most of the time, people don't have time to put, well, first of all, they don't even know what posters are. But second of all, there's no artist that really lasts long enough to be relevant in the moment, except for Drake or Beyonce. But think about, or what's her name, Taylor Swift. But think about to the level of which they have to compete, right? They're dropping surprise albums, they're taking over concerts, they're creating experiential things all over the country to try to stay relevant. And the idea of what happened is that people stopped looking at artists as the thing that they were, like that they wanted to be. Now, I call us accidental narcissists because technology has shown us that we're at the center of everything that we want to do. Now we take celebrities and we take artists and we make them part of our ecosystem, right? They're just little satellites and we pick and choose who we want to represent us. And that's sort of the reality of business today. Businesses and brands are no longer created, they're co-created. And the idea of an experience, a shared experience, is the thing that becomes defining. It's the ultimate metric. Did you experience this and everything the way that I designed? Because that's the way it should be. Yet, we still create products in the absence of actually thinking of where they should go and what they could do. We still shout at people using all kinds of traditional forms of marketing. We use new forms of technology in order to do the same things we used to do. I call that mediumism, right? So we get all of these social, mobile apps and networks, but we don't necessarily bring a new philosophy to it. We don't recognize that part of the power of all of these technologies that are happening today is the fact that they're completely democratized, right? That they're driven by us, not from the top down. And the minute we understand that, it's the minute we could become part of it instead of trying to dictate it or talk to it or talk down to it. So there's design, right? And there's creativity, and there's reality. I've gotten in a ton of debates with people saying, well, Brian, what you're really talking about is just creativity and design. But the answer is no, I'm not. What I'm talking about is what I did with the book is reverse engineering people, how they behave, their aspirations, right? Because they're different, and let it start to affect me differently in order to do something differently. Because that's where true innovation starts, right? It's unlocking new value, right? Otherwise, it's just iteration, which is just doing things maybe better. That's X. The book is called X because we have all of these disparate movements within an organization, brand experience, we have user experience, we have customer experience, we have with you, we have Xbox. But at the end of the day, X is experience. It is going to happen, whether you design it or not. And the thing about business today, I mean, we're all customers of some business. And there are aspects of businesses I'm sure you love, and there's aspects of businesses I'm sure you hate. But why does that have to be the case anymore? Because anything can come along and change that now. And I think that experience is rooted in the little things, and you have to design for them, right? You have to design for the things that you want to be special, that you want to stand out. You know, I work with one company that after they talk to a customer, and believe me, this is not as scalable as, you know, a contact center, but after they talk to a customer, they will send a handwritten note, right? It just blows people away, right? And of course, their retention numbers soar, and then word of mouth then kicks up acquisition, and like, oh, there's some ROI. Who knew? Because I always wondered, like, what's the I in ROI if it stands for ignorance? Like, what happens if we don't do anything? And I realized some of the greatest sources of innovation came from outside of our normal day, right? We tend to look at our markets, our usual competitors, right? And I found that absolutely limits our creativity. So you look to other things. How are people engaging folks today? How are they engaging folks yesterday? You know, for example, at Disneyland, the bricks in all of their buildings get smaller as they get taller. And that's to force, as we were talking earlier, perspective. So that you as an adult can feel like a child again in the park, which is supposed to rekindle your inner child. But to the extent of which they go to that detail, right? There's no reason why we can't go to that detail. These are experiences. These are the things you remember. These are the things you love. And every one of these moments counts, right? Technology, I think, is best when it's invisible. Right? There was a time where it didn't have to be. I grew up programming DOS and Fortran and all of these things that I'm glad I forgot. But this is a moment where technology comes to life, right? And I also look at this as being an example of customer experience, as being some of the greatest, right? Because it's not just about what she's wearing, it's about what's happening behind the scenes. And the fact that a company like Disney had to build an entirely new infrastructure to reimagine the customer experience, right? This is the Magic Band, right? To her, she can get into the park, she can get into Fast Pass, she can open her hotel door, she can pay for souvenirs and food. It's got proximity devices in it so that if she makes a reservation at one of the restaurants, it knows when she's coming and it'll greet her on the front wall. And there are people that I have to debate with that say, well, that is just creepy. Nobody wants that. That's violating my privacy. But that's the way it used to be, right? I promise you that the word privacy doesn't mean what it used to mean, right? Privacy now is a currency of which we exchange for value. And so to her, those are all things of value. And the back end of Disney is studying all of these movements, they're studying all of these engagements, and they're looking at ways that they can innovate in park design, ways to reduce the queue. They got rid of all of the turnstiles. They're thinking about new ways of currency within the park. So they're taking this and improving the experience, right? So for now, they're trading that data for experience, and it's intentional, right? It's purpose-driven. And so that's why I believe that it's all just a matter of perspective, and that's what unlocks, or better yet, it unleashes possibilities. I get in my way every single time I try to write, every time I try to research, every time I try to design something new, and it's just good old psychology, right? Cognitive bias and validation bias. I don't see the world as it is, I see the world as I am, and then make decisions accordingly. Our entire life, our entire career, our entire education has brought us to these moments that are now maybe partially relevant. The one thing that I've learned is that perspective actually triggers learning. When you shift perspective, you learn something. You allow yourself to learn something. And this is when I realized I was just a student. I had to relearn everything, and I still have to relearn everything. And I'm not saying you all need to just go out and start learning new things, but this is the heart of experience design. And when you shift perspective, you could see it in everything, right? How many of you have seen this picture before? Just one or two? Okay, well, this is a picture I wanted to share with you because it represents sort of the challenges that we have today, right? Every executive I meet with will look at this picture and say, this is exactly what's wrong with society. No one can live at the moment. They're all on their phones. They can't look up, except for this dear, sweet woman right here in the front. She's in the moment. Look at that smile on her face. But you could argue with the shift of perspective, well, I want the people who are on their phones sharing this moment with every single one of their audiences who have audiences with audiences, because now that moment is bigger than just whomever's there. And look at this selfish woman here in the front, not sharing this moment with all her Facebook friends that couldn't be there. So the idea is you can see what you want to see in anything, right? And validation bias, cognitive bias, I mean, especially for those of us in the room who are parents, we tend to sort of let that get in the way of innovation. So this is an art series where the photographer removes the phone from everyday scenarios. And I use it to illustrate the point that we live in an ecosystem, right? Everything is so counterintuitive about design and the idea of what an experience is, right? What an experience is to me versus what an experience is to someone who lives a digital lifestyle are just radically different, right? I would have just written another book had I not gone through this. And the one thing that it unlocked in me was empathy. And I realized that empathy, I always thought I was empathetic, right? But I realized the closest I ever got was sympathy. Right? I could feel you, but I didn't go through life as you. Right? And the minute you do, it changes the game, right? This is a sidewalk in China where you walk on one side with your phone and on the other side without your phone. It's very real, by the way. I promise you we're going to have this in airports because I can't seem to get around anybody. Or this. See, to them, it is the best party ever. Right? They're telling each other that. They're telling everybody that. They're Snapchatting these moments. There's probably 1,000 selfies going on. Or things like Tinder, right? Some of us think it's a dating app. But the point of it is that all of these things are sort of changing your expectation. Each one of these apps, each one of these services, each one of these technologies is basically programming people to know that they're the center of the universe, right? Every app tells them that, right? Or the idea that if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you would get a whole different set of answers from people who live online or people who live a connected lifestyle. Yet we tend to design still for the world that we know, not for this hype. I mean, people freak out in moments like this. One of the things that I didn't share with you, which changed my whole world, was I'm a digital analyst by trade. But about 10 years ago, I became a digital anthropologist as well, because technology, well, it's accelerating, right? And the ability to track all of the technology networks, apps, devices, all of these things, I track it in the wheel of disruption, which gets crazier every single year. But understanding technology's impact on us was a bit slower, but more so is a bit more meaningful. And it was these stats that I wanted to share with you that really started to bring things to life for me. We right now look at our phones on average about 1,500 times a week, which adds up to about 177 minutes a day. And I promise you that there is all kinds of science that shows, not just millennials, all of us, that we're reprogramming our brains as we do so, right? You're becoming a little less patient. You're becoming a little bit more, let's just say, optimized in what it is that you're trying to do. Time, suddenly, there's not enough of it. And as a human being, this is affecting you as you make decisions around the companies you do business with. And over time, this means that whom you're working with and how you're working with them is now changing your expectations, right? So this is why an Uber comes along and decimates the taxi industry. While I was writing this book, the reason why I decided to look at how people engage with digital and mobile and social and then apply that to paper was because of a video I watched many years ago of a 1-year-old baby using a tablet. Right? Just all very intuitive. And her father thought it would be funny if he handed her a magazine. And of course, the first thing she does is this. And it doesn't work, she starts crying. And her father says, to my daughter, a magazine is an iPad that doesn't work. And it will be that way for the rest of her life. And I was like, mind blown, because here I was on YouTube just having avoidance behavior syndrome. And it ended up changing me because it was a demonstration of cognitive bias. I had to learn what a tablet was. I had to learn what a smartphone was. There's an entire generation and another generation behind them that had to learn what a magazine is, right? And if you bring that to an intersection of how you would make a decision versus how they would make a decision, it's radically different. And so we were designing the world with hoops and touch points and journeys that were completely outdated from the get-go. But it's not just about younger generations. I've got all kinds of studies that show that we're all becoming just a connected society, right? Of course. But I can promise you that a 55-year-old who lives an active digital lifestyle makes similar decisions or exhibits similar decision-making behaviors as a 25-year-old, right? And now that means our opportunity for engagement, for experience design, now has to take extraordinary leaps of moving forward. To the point where now there are groups studying the effect that Tinder has on younger brains and whether or not they can take that into testing, right? Because if you think about it, they're getting really good at left, right, yes, no, A, B, and it's engaging. And so that's then, if we can make things more engaging, right? If we can reinvent a book, I wanted to take all of these insights, I am taking all these insights and giving them away to textbook companies so that they can hopefully do something a little bit more relevant. But if you play this out in a daily environment, whether it's just business or whatever it is, right? The way people go through life now is very clunky because they're now having to go through these touch points that we've put out there that are just rooted in pre or Internet 1.0 sort of philosophies and perspectives, right? Again, remember, the design we've put out there versus the design that people take, too fast, is different. And so I use ketchup as a metaphor, right? Because there's years that none of us challenged the ketchup bottle, right? We all even came up with strategies for it. 45 degrees, or the soft part of your hand. Oh, no. A knife. A knife is what's going to do it every time. And then someone came along and said, you know what works? Gravity with a bit of a squeeze. That's going to work. That's far more effective. But it is an example of experience design, right? And so we tend to just go, because bottles have been the thing that everybody's always done, right? But then I live in Silicon Valley, but it's the way it's always been done is a quote said by no successful entrepreneur ever, right? And so everything then could be reimagined. And I work a lot with Google, and they found these crazy things called micro moments that now take experience design to a whole new level. So you got to imagine Google, or Bing, right? You think traditional search when people aren't actually using search engines on a smartphone, because in those moments, what comes back is websites, right? And nobody loves a mobile website experience for two reasons. Even if you have responsive design, we haven't reimagined the definition of a website since 1995. It is still brochureware, right? Yet now we have so little patience. So remember, 60 seconds on the high school student front, now you have to make a decision. they found that in these moments, they're going to other places, right? I think one of the biggest threats to search engines right now is Amazon and YouTube, because people just want things fast. But one of the stats that they came back with just blew me away, which was 90% of people who go into a micro moment to make a decision are brand agnostic. So now, when you're thinking about creating experiences, the nature of an experience has to be, well, what's going to get your attention based on what you're trying to do? And then how are we going to move forward together? Because most people in those micro moments who get information that helps them, they will move forward with them. So now everything is up for grabs, right? So the idea of why our company is being disrupted by startups that come out of nowhere, well, here's why, right? Because these things are relevant. And when it boils down to what it really is all about, it's perspective. It's what you leave here today with, whether you look at things the same way or you're open to new possibilities. But I get it, right? Part of the process is the process, right? I work with people who are booked all day, every day, on the hour, perpetually running a few minutes late to every meeting because the other one ran up against the hour. And then they have email on top of that, and they're supposed to try to do new things. But we can't do new things if we don't do new things. And so I found all kinds of examples. I could be here all day with you. I had so many examples of things that we take for granted every single day, like quotes like if Henry Ford, if I would have asked people what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse, or be the change you want to see in the world. I found all of these things that we take for granted every day. It turns out that those really weren't the sources who said that stuff. Or 1971 TV Guide, right? For some of you in the room, we used to get this magazine that showed us what was on television for the week. So you have essentially a brand new device of which to explore television, yet we haven't innovated much in how you navigate this beautiful screen. Because no one saw the opportunity to say, well, what could this experience be for a new generation of people, right? What could television programming be? So what's happening now, right? This experience basically is what it is. But now you have things like Netflix, you have programmatic content, you have things like YouTube, you have all of these different apps that are starting to change how you think about programming. Well, I wonder why. It's because we never really reimagined the opportunity. Well, it's everywhere. Everything you do in life could be reimagined for a modern experience, right? This sucks. It sucks so bad that in part of the book, I studied it. What happened? Turns out that going back to the 1950s, we decided that what we should do is just add more buttons. Remote controls, on average, have 70 buttons today in a world of this, right? The first app for the television was a remote control, just a bunch of buttons on your smart screen. This is iteration, and this is what we tend to do when we are introduced to new technologies and when we're gifted with this opportunity to reimagine experiences. We can't really take an iterative approach because you'll end up with the remote control. You have to take a completely different approach, right? Parking signs. Think about that moment when you have to park. You probably are under pressure, there's cars honking behind you, and you're trying to make a decision about whether you can stop here. So the city of New York says, this is bad, we hear you. We're going to come up with a whole new parking experience. So they open it up to creative agencies, and they got a parking sign. So there's a great artist in Los Angeles who said, well, I don't know if that's any better. Why not something that we could all understand based on how we visually take cues from the screens that we use all day long, right? Oh, I guess I'm in the red at this moment. So sympathy versus empathy. This is an app that turns the camera on your phone so that you can text safely without getting hit by cars or running into streets or poles. It's also not the most popular app because it's hard to do that. But it is a metaphor for seeing the world differently, right? Because it is different. It is so different that in order to design meaningful experiences, we have to be inspired by how people are different, right? And I look to the good old days of Disney and storyboarding, because there's a magic to storyboarding I think a lot of us didn't know. I didn't know, actually, what storyboarding really was about. I thought it was about basically putting together snippets of the story to sort of test it out before you went into the animation process. It turns out that it's a way of humanizing the characters, making them believable, testing the story, forcing you to act them out so that other people around you can say yes, say no. And Airbnb, about 3 years ago, I mean, this is a 7-year-old startup, so about 4 years into their life, decided that there was a problem with Airbnb in terms of its scale. And if you remember all of the news reports back in the day about, well, Airbnb, that's the place where you go to have drug and sex parties, you know, and or you get your stuff stolen. So they realized, look, what we need to do is go through. They were inspired by the storyboard process that Disney used for Snow White. And they got all of their customer data, they got all their user data. They also got data from some of the best, like the Ritz-Carlton, like what made a great Ritz-Carlton experience. And they put all that data into storyboards. They first came up with these characters, right? Who are the types of hosts we have, and who are the types of hosts we want, and who are the guests we have, and who are the guests we want. And how do we bring those stories to life in ways that Airbnb can then be a real alternative or a real central imperative to them? And it turns out that there was a lot of things that they took for granted in their journeys and also in their host and guest experiences. And that was this. Things like, if you're a guest and you were in traffic on the way to the property, or you encountered some of the wonderful people at TSA at the airport, all of those things were contributing to the guest experience. So for them, they realized that the Airbnb brand was in the hands of their hosts. So they needed to better understand their hosts. Why were they hosting? What were they looking to get out of this? How could we be sort of their partner in delivering experiences that matter to them and to the guest? And realize that they had to invest in experience architecture, which is almost like saying, this is what people are going to feel, this is what people are going to leave with, and this is how we're going to make that happen. So for example, a good host now is being trained and conditioned to help their guests build a relationship before they get to the property so that they can understand, well, what are your preferences? What do you like? For example, I just went to one in Santa Cruz, and all of those questions came to life in the form of my favorite wine on the table, a nice handwritten note, and just a wonderful journey, a wonderful experience that was intentional. And all of that because of this storyboarding experience. They hired a Pixar storyboard artist. His name is Nick Sung. And he came out and brought this all to life. And I brought him out, once I heard this story, to help me storybook what I wanted my book to be based on who the reader really was and what a day in the life was. And it was such a profound experience that I had to start over. I had to trash the book and start over. I hated him for that, but I loved him for that. And so I actually believe that all these different disciplines, UX, CX, BX, these are all the things that just bring up the letter X. And the letter X to me is part storytelling, right? Part user-centered design, definitely human-centered design, but coming together in a meaningful experience architecture of which then literally transforms the entire dynamic of business, right? Everything someone touches around your company, whether it's employees or customers, affect the experience. And believe it or not, none of these things work together today. In fact, and oftentimes they're competitive. But now, in an age of accidental narcissists or the ecosystem, every bit of this has to be optimized, streamlined, and integrated to deliver something that people want. Because if they don't, they'll leave. They'll go somewhere else, and there's a science to all of this. This can all be drawn out. This is an experience map around a particular moment, and it's made sure that everything is accounted for. This is an experience flow that shows you how all of those moments come together to play out. And I actually believe that when you design for people based on how they are, not how you are, a lot of really cool things happen. So I want to leave you with this. Innovation is something that begins with a shift in perspective. It's never technology. Technology is a byproduct of how you shifted perspective and how you knew about something you didn't know before to design it. Experience and innovation is something you have to feel, right? You have to be motivated and inspired to want to do something differently about it. And then it's about action, right? But it's got to be the type of action where it's okay to try. It's okay to take risks, right? One of the biggest things that prevent any kind of innovation is fear, or politics, or egos, or a lot of just stuff, right? But in reality, there's no choice, right? This is what I want to leave you with. This is a blank canvas, and I realized the only way I was going to get this book out was to just start from scratch. It was harder and easier to do so. But if you think back to the beginning of This is Water, right, and the story of the fish, this is space. And it's yours to design in a time and in an era that's different than what we came up in. And that's okay, right? Because that's how we continue to earn relevance, not just with our roles, right? But think about what this means to what you're going to mean tomorrow. And more so the relationships with your colleagues and with customers and their customers and everybody that results in a process, right? Because now what you're essentially doing is recognizing that innovation is something that starts with you. So thank you very much, and we'll go to questions. But not all at once. So who has a question for me? Yes.
The business model for a beautiful coffee table book that has great business insights seems disconnected. Not just the price point here, but just in the marketplace itself. How did you pull that off?
Okay, so his question actually was a part I forgot to tell you, because his question is this: the economic model of a book like this versus cover price versus the infrastructure that it took to get the book out. How did I pull it off? It was a very, very difficult series of conversations, right? Because there's one thing to sort of come up with a beautiful book, but if any of you have ever bought a coffee table book, you'll notice that they're much more expensive. That's because the production process of a coffee table book is not at scale of the regular textbooks or regular business books. That's why business books all look the same. My idea was I had to make the case to the publisher, and there was a little bit of history, right? I don't think I could have done this on the first or second book, but I had to also help them find a new economic model to produce this book, because it would have been easy to do it at a $100 price point. However, I had to bring it into the neighborhood of a traditional business book. So we had to find an entirely new supply chain for this book. And we were able to bring the price points down. In fact, as you saw it, I don't know how many of the first ones were, they were only $10. We were able to find a whole new supply chain model to build this book. Now, this was hard, wasn't easy. In fact, the first 10,000 copies that came off the press, about 4,000 or 5,000 of those were hand-fed, because we were just trying to get it, to make it work. But then we found the right processes of which to design and build it, and now it works. It's a thicker paper. The color saturation had to be able to sustain that. Wasn't easy. However, every author after me is going to have it easy, because now there's a whole infrastructure for this. Yes.
I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit. During the course of your research, when you talk to different organizations about how they approach design, have you come across new models of how to integrate the whole practice of design? And when I say design, I mean the big design that's not, visual design and make the icon look a little bit nicer into the whole business operations, because I think that's something that companies are wrestling with, including ours, where we're moving from a traditional functional hierarchy to one that is supposed to be a lot more networked and matrixed.
Yeah, part of that. So I study this also in my research, and a lot of it falls under what's called digital transformation. So there's this movement within organizations that are realizing that a lot of their infrastructures to compete in a digital economy are, let's just say, slow and process driven, and this prevents decision making, which prevents speed and also prevents collaboration, right? So the closest a lot of organizations get are sort of matrixed. But if you look at some of the companies that I think we've all celebrated for years, like Disney or Nike, they have a design culture, right? It's just that way. But how do other businesses get there? It's really difficult. So one of the things that's a catalyst, turns out, is the customer experience. And they're looking at the digital customer experience specifically to show where they are weak. And then they form groups over time, of course. And all this research is free that you guys could just download. Just my name, Brian Solis, and digital transformation. Because I show exactly what they're doing to create the case, how they create the case. The way it's done is they look at the differences between their digital customers and the customers they think that they're designing for. And they look at where the friction is, where the differences are, and where they are and where they need to be. And they come up with this prioritized roadmap. And then the conversations begin by saying, what do we need to do to get there? Well, what we need to do is bring this person and this person and this person together to start forming. So it's almost like a matrix approach, but they actually end up forming new divisions within the organization. So it's process reinvention, it's model reinvention, and a lot of these things start as little pockets of innovation, if you will, right, to solve big problems or solve for bigger opportunities now. That plays out over time, which becomes digital transformation because they get momentum. They always get momentum, and then that starts to grow. And in 2 weeks, I have a report called The 6 Stages of Digital Transformation that specifically detail how companies get from one stage to the next, so that companies like Microsoft can just say, okay, here's where we are, we can benchmark ourselves here, here's what other companies are doing, and now let's prioritize these things. By the way, one of the biggest challenges of this isn't intention, right? Everybody, I think, wants to do the right thing. It's just culture. Culture gets in the way a lot of times. Yes?
So how does brand relate to experience design, like the brand as we have today?
I think brand used to be something that was creative, right? We used to bring to life with imagery, with messaging, with scenarios. I think that the best way is to look at, well, what's the experience you want someone to have, right? I mean, the girl with the smile, that's a Disney experience, and that is also the Disney brand, right? It's just meant to evoke sort of this smile in everything that you do, and to remember that whatever age you are a child, and you are allowed to be imaginative, and you are allowed to be creative. That is all, though, Imagineering. Everything that Disney does is based on architecture. And they apply that thinking. It's rich throughout the culture. They have a university in Florida that teaches this type of thinking. And they try to bring businesses through to say, you can't just have a brand. A brand has to be something that's experienced. And then in turn, the measurement is, well, what did you think? Well, this is what I felt. And that's perfect, because that's what we designed it for. You know, Disney takes Imagineering all the way down to everything they do, like their cruise ships. The rooms, they thought of all the little things, like that families were going to be in this room, probably too many people that should be in one room. But they designed the room where the desk becomes a bed, this thing folds down from a wall to make another bed, the bathroom and the sink are split in a tiny little cruise ship quarter, so someone could use the restroom while someone's taking a shower. You know, these things are all intentional, but they all ladder up to the Disney experience, which is then the Disney brand, right? So it's human-centered and reverse engineered in that regard. Yes?
Do you have any ideas around ways to get your voice of the customer? I'm running a service right now, and I just feel like I have to go grab it out of my users to figure out ways to improve.
You know, there's two schools of thought that I think should be merged. One is the voice of the customer, right? And then there's the voice of the customer you don't have. And Starbucks, for example, will say that they don't look at other coffee companies as their competitors. They actually have, you know, to your point about digital transformation earlier, they have a new division that starts with merging an aspect of IT, but specifically for innovation and specifically around mobile and payments, a group around basically what's chief digital officer in order to build architectures to rapidly test and learn. And they do this because they think their biggest competitors are PayPal and other companies like that. Because they're finding that the mobile payment sector, there's a ton of things that they could learn about that customer that they could design for in Starbucks, which is why Starbucks just came up with the deal with Instacart that you could, like Uber, you could have your coffee brought to you, right? And people do that. So how do you then activate that? A part of it is that a voice of a customer program sucks if you're really just trying to yank things out. So you might as well be a dentist. Or you could build a community, an active community, a thriving community of which that thing is always on, and there's value of being in that community. There's value to belonging. And then part of that is you're providing insights and information and benefits to them, and you're getting something in return, which is feedback and insights. But what ends up happening is as you build up community, and there's a lot of case studies out of a company like Lithium, for example, where you can get how this is done. Turns out that the more you invest in communities as your VOC program, the more, I guess, the better your feedback is, because the more engaged people feel, that the better the satisfaction. A lot of these things, retention goes up, all because you ended up doing something to get something that ended up becoming something better.
We've actually got a lot of questions online, but one is, says, although anyone, including engineers, can design products with empathy, have you found a correlation between innovation and companies that are structured around non-engineers? The example is hearing that at Apple, the designers and marketers lead on product development, and the engineers just execute on designers, marketers' vision.
Well, he brought up Apple. I wasn't going to. I know one of the original 6 on the iPhone design team. It's a good friend of mine, and the stories he tells are just, incredible. And one of the things, he's partly engineer, but he's also part design thinker. And one of the stories he tells was how they were originally forming the team for the iPhone, and they went out and they found all of the best engineers in the game to bring onto the iPhone team. And they presented to Steve about their ideas of who the superstar team was going to be. And Steve did one of those things, basically said, no, I don't want anyone who's ever worked on a phone to work on the iPhone. And so that is sort of, and you think about it, he wasn't an engineer either, right? But you have to bring into that moment not just empathy, but vision, right? So there is an aspect of what people do that unlocks empathy, of which you feel, which is supposed to unlock innovation, of which you see, and then you bring in the team of engineers and architects to bring this to life. Because it can't just be any one aspect of it, right? We're not all going to change overnight. We're all going to bring our little cognitive biases to that meeting, but that's why we have to work towards this vision. And somebody has to have that vision, because then that gives everybody purpose. And that, I think, it's a very complex answer, but that's the way it's always done. That's how it happens. And by the way, nobody said, going back to Uber, what if we design an application of which it was driven by a moment where we all got stuck in Paris in the snow, because if you get just a sprinkle of snow on the ground, all the taxi drivers decided to take the day off. And so we were stranded from a conference called Le Web in Paris, and that was driven by an idea of pain, right? And then Uber became, well, what can we do to solve for that now? So that's just one approach. Okay, one more.
There was another question online. I'll use it.
Amy, please represent the voice of the online customer.
There was several questions around sort of similar to what you were just saying, but around non-design organizations like HR. Like, how do you get this perspective into an organization that doesn't typically think this way?
Which is ironic because it's human resources, right? When I talk to HR, this is why my next focus is on culture, because this is actually the crux of what we're starting to talk about. When I talk to HR about this, how do we design employee experience, right? And I look at, well, what's your greatest challenge? You know what the answer I get is? You're gonna love this. The answer I get from HR is their biggest challenge is millennials. So, what do you mean? Just a blanket statement like that? Well, they don't work within our processes. They always want to be reviewed more than the review processes are there. They don't like their management infrastructure. They want a little bit more freedom. They want to be able to switch jobs and bring. So I said, okay, so you're going to just basically change the fundamental nature of who they are. Is that what you're asking me how to do that? Because I have kids and I'm asking myself, how do I do that, right? So I walked them through a scenario. I said, "No, just give me a real world problem, something that you're dealing with today." And they said, well, okay, all right. So we can't hire millennials and we need them because they're the future of the company. I said, well, what do you mean you can't hire millennials? Well, because they're going to Green Door or Glassdoor, they're going to YouTube and they're typing in our company name and they're getting a lot of things back that say that we're not the best place to work. So what are you guys thinking about doing? We were going to produce a bunch of great YouTube videos about how great it is to work here. So that sounds fantastic. But are you lying? I mean, are you looking at the problem? The problem is that they don't want to work here because of probably things that don't relate to their values, their aspirations, their goals, right? Those are core questions you have to ask yourself. Like, are you willing to design for them? Because everything is evolutionary. It doesn't just mean because that's the way we've always done it, is the way you're supposed to do it. It's called creative destruction. It's a long time standing economic term. Something new comes along and completely, that's a definition of disruption, by the way. And I'm going to apply this to HR. Iteration is doing things better. Innovation is doing new things that creates new value. And disruption is doing new things that make the old ones obsolete, right? HR is obsolete. Right? And so if you do not disrupt it, it will be disrupted for you. And I said, let's just now come up with the core values of what the organization could be, because that's a leadership thing, right? I think we're caught in a rut of management. Second thing is, what if I wanted to apply for a job? How would we do that? Oh, here, we bring on these forms. You enter this job code, which brings up another form. And I said, all right, well, let's go through it. So I got out my phone, and I said, okay, give me that URL. Oh, no, you can't. It doesn't work on that. I said, exactly. So you're asking someone to conform to you when you're human resources, and your job is to basically cater to the human being inside the organization, look out for their well-being. And that's the hard part, right? Because human resources is a perfect example of how, same with call centers, right? They're all just perfect examples of how we lost touch with human beings. And that's why I'm a big believer in empathy in terms of any experience design. Everything can be reimagined, and has to be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.